A little earlier, though we wanted to have it. This is the second of the conversations we are having in the office this year. The first one was about private equity and how do organizations like us needs to look into how, I mean, trying to get into the bricks of how to look into private equity, what exactly is the role they play in changing policies in the country. We are very happy to have Shalmali here today. It was quite a chance because she was coming also to Delhi, and many of us have been interacting with her in the life of the CFA itself from the very beginning and much before. She has been quite a keen watcher of international finance, trade, have been active participants in movements, resistance movements, being a voice of the people in both in negotiations and also in the streets. So this time it is a pleasure hearing you. She's also part of the CFA advisory. So I mean, every time, whether it is the ADB campaign, whether it is the elections, some of us would be new to you, but I think this is a crowd which you generally know. We may expect one or two people more as per communications over WhatsApp and email. You know, not beyond that. So that's thanks and welcome. We'll start with a small round of introductions. I'm Maju. I work with CFA. Yeah, I'm working as part of the international finance team. And also works in taking some of those discussions to the colleges, organizing small programs in colleges and in communities on development finance.
I'm Ashwati. I work with CFA as well. I joined in August to actually put together a conference on energy finance, the discussions of which are going on right now.
Hi, I'm Shalmali. I also work with CFA. I am Tika. I work with Focus on the Global South.
Hi, I'm Anil. I work with Delhi Forum.
I'm Ankit. I work with CFA.
I'm Joe. I work with all of them.
Benny, I work as a researcher with the Transnational Institute.
Manshi, I'm part of a small collective called Himdhara, which is doing work on environmental issues in Himachal.
I'm Nishank. I work with CFA.
Tammy, I work with CFA.
Priyadarshini, I work with CFA.
Ashish Kazla. I'm a part of National Finance Team, CFA.
Sanjeev, Delhi Solitico.
I'm Shalmali. I'm with CFA. Oh, at least I know somebody in this team. So I'm with Focus on the Global South. So, thank you for inviting me. Maju, shall we just proceed, or how do we go forward, or?
Proceed.
I think everybody knows about Focus, no? I mean, what we are, most of you know, one way or another. We tried to reinvent ourselves, but eventually, I guess a tiger can't really change its stripes. So we are who we are, you know. And right now, we have we have a program in India. I mean, in the sense, in terms of monitoring and analysis, but we're also doing a lot of on-the-ground monitoring of development and trade and finance and investment issues, particularly the commons in Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, and the Philippines. We try to do as much regional Asia work as possible. But one of the things we try very hard to do is to link whatever is happening at the policy and at the trend level with what people are experiencing at the grassroots level. Because we feel that that's the part that's a very important part of the picture. And if that part of the picture is missing, then you have grassroots struggles or unions or people's movements, formations who are fighting for, you know, their ideas or their ideals, and then you have that level of policy advocacy, policy change, and the two don't actually meet. They can often go in divergent directions. And if you look at the struggles and the movements happening on, say, climate change and energy, And renewables, for example, you can see that in fact quite clearly. If you look at for the issue of corporate accountability, I'll give you examples of that. That's sort of a good example of how these are going, not just in parallel, but divergent directions in terms of, the politics of the demands of what people want in terms of real change on the ground, and in terms of what the policy people and the policy advocates are pushing for. So that's one of the reasons why we believe that it's very, very important for the voices of those who are at the front lines and the voices of those who are, most directly impacted to be amplified and to be not just participate, but to be able to take charge of that debate and discourse where policies will be changed. So, of course, a big part of all this is money, finance, which brings us to the issue of trade and investment and finance trends. So, one issue that we have been working on a lot is what we call the new generation trade and investment agreements. Just out of, as an abbreviation, I use the word FTA, Free Trade Agreement. But the new generation free trade agreements are not only about trade. They're about investment as well. They're very, very comprehensive. So the new generation, and the EU, the European Union, already I think was in the year 2000, they started these things called the Economic Partnership Agreements. And economic partnership agreements that they signed with Africa, Caribbean, Pacific countries. And the acronym there is ACP. So if you're reading policy documents on the World Trade Organization, or if you read any of the policy documents of the European Union, you'll see ACP, ACP is Africa, Caribbean, Pacific. So they already started in 2000, these agreements. And these economic partnership agreements were about opening up the economy, the country's economy to trade, liberalizing, or they call liberalization, opening up the economy, right? So meaning that you remove tariffs, so allow imports to come in without tariffs. You remove other standards, you may have other standards, for example, health standards or sanitary standards, or you may have other objections, in terms of environmental and social standards. You remove them, so you open up the economy and allow the imports to come in. So the liberalization of trade, they all included investment, particularly in key sectors of infrastructure, services, key issues on services, finance, etc. And very importantly, they included what they call policy support and economic reforms programs, which is very similar, not very similar, it's more or less the same as what the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank have been pushing, these policy reform programs, which is for liberalization. So these economic partnership agreements were, EPAs they were called, they were very comprehensive. And the EU was very proud of it. They were very proud that they were actually, moving forward the liberalization agenda. Now, that was then. So now today, when we look at 2019, in the last 10 years, we have seen this mushroom of free trade and investment agreements. Again, I'll use the term FTAs or whatever, which are between countries, bilateral, but then you have what they call plurilateral, so which means some countries, not all, and then regional. So for example, regional would be what's happening in ASEAN. So ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is those 10 countries, I think you know which they are, right? But it starts from Myanmar and goes through mainland Southeast Asia, all the mainland Southeast Asia countries, and then Indonesia, Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia is part of India, and then East Timor not yet decided whether it will be part of ASEAN or will it be part of the small island development states. They have all these formations, right? So ASEAN has an ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. So that's a regional agreement. They have an ASEAN Economic Community. They have an ASEAN Comprehensive Investment Agreement. So these are regional. And the goal of this regional agreement is to make ASEAN a common producer base, a common distributor base, and a common market base. So that is make all of ASEAN one massive free trade and investment area, right? And that involves basically what they call harmonizing regulations across all the ASEAN countries where it comes to key issues such as trade, investment, and so on. Now, this has a very, very real bearing, of course, on the ground, and we'll come to that in a minute. This is an example of a regional agreement. But then there are these plurilateral agreements, and the plurilateral agreements actually came out of the World Trade Organization. Because the World Trade Organization is a multilateral agreement, which means all the countries that have to agree on every agreement. So anything that's being negotiated inside the WTO, all governments have to agree to it, then it becomes a multilateral decision. But because progress was very slow on many fronts, and progress was very slow thanks to struggles from people's movements and unions, and progressive NGOs, and progressive academics, and many progressive legislators, in fact, many Indian policymakers, people from Indonesia, Philippines, Latin America, Africa, even in Europe, for example, many of the left political parties, and in the United States, some of Bernie Sanders has a small base, but people in his party and so in sub-caucus. So, groups of these people getting together were pointing out the problems of the WTO. So negotiations were not moving forward as quickly as they were on a number of issues. So then what the WTO did was they changed their rules. They changed their rules by saying those countries that can agree on moving an agreement forward, let them get together. They will make an agreement and move forward. That will not be a WTO agreement. It won't be a WTO decision, in that it won't be a fully multilateral decision. And Benny's also been studying this, so very carefully whenever you have added information on these issues. But those who can agree will move forward and go ahead. So they started this sort of trend towards plurilateral agreements. Now after that, of course, there are other plurilateral agreements, which means that you can have an assortment of countries from different regions. So say India can join, the EU can join, say Kenya, 4 or 5 countries from around the world can come together and say, okay, we agree to liberalize trade in some particular kind of wood or in some particular kind of resin, So plurilateral would be that kind. The countries can come from anywhere. So this is we have those types of agreements. And then of course we have what we call the mega FTAs. The mega FTAs are where you cover a significant part of the world's population. So for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which is now being revived, is massive. Then you have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is massive. Now TPP was everybody in the world except China. RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is everybody in the world but the United States. In some ways. Then you have TTIP, the transatlantic investment, that whatever partnership is there, from the two sides of the Atlantic. Now even with APEC, which is the Asia Pacific Economic Community, APEC wants to have a mega, what they call free trade agreement, FTA, which will bring together many of the countries in TPP, many of the countries in RCEP, many of the small island states. So basically all this buzz is going on, Now, in RCEP, in the ASEAN, in the TPP, in the TTIP, there are many advances. There are many. How do I say? Many agreements have been, are moving forward. So it's not, everything isn't all frozen. The governments meet, they have these ministerial meetings, they agree on something, they don't agree on something. So they are happening in one way or another. The negotiators are meeting. Now, I'll come to the problem with those negotiations in a minute. But another aspect of another type of investment agreement that I think is also important to know is how countries make also investment agreements with other regions. So India is negotiate with the EU. India is negotiating with ASEAN. China already had for a long time an agreement with ASEAN. ASEAN is negotiating with the EU. The Philippines is negotiating with the EU. Japan is negotiating with the Philippines. South Korea is negotiating with ASEAN, and I think they're trying to bring Philippines into the bargain. So there are also these, formations that are happening. Now, one would think that I guess if you're negotiating with one, you could negotiate with the other. So that shouldn't be an issue. But I'll give you an example of how this issue starts to get more and more complicated. So China, for example, the big, the big bogeyman of the entire world these days. So, and I'm saying that tongue in cheek. I don't believe that China is the big bogeyman because I think there are many challenges with what investment comes from China, but the same kinds of things are also coming from other countries, and that's another conversation whether investment coming from China is particularly worse than investment going from other countries. That's another thing to be discussed. But to make China to be out to be the bad investor while the others are good, I think is a big mistake. It's a big fallacy in my view. But taking this example, so China wants 3 special economic zones in Vietnam. Now these 3 special economic zones, it wants them as special administrative zones as well. Okay, which means that it wants people from China and investors to be able to move to Vietnam in and out without a passport. So basically, it's an extraterritorial concession. So it's a colony. Okay. Now, of course, people in Vietnam are up in arms about it. There have been lots of protests, etc., which we don't read about in the papers, but there have been protests, and National Assembly is really upset about it. National Assembly is full of elected legislators, so they're wondering what to do because their constituencies are freaking out and getting upset with them. In the meantime, the government is the executive, and they're saying, no, this is important, we have to move forward, we have to deal with China, we have to deal with the US, etc. So this sort of test of wills is happening. But one of the things that's really interesting is that the Ministry of Commerce has not actually talked to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Vietnam is a member of the WTO. Vietnam is a member of ASEAN. Vietnam is a member of RCEP. All of them have a clause called MFN, Most Favored Nation. Most Favored Nation rules often are that if we are part of the same alliance, right, I should give all of you the same privileges. So if I give Sanjeev a certain privilege to come to my country and we're part of the same alliance, I have to give all of you the same privilege. So if he's getting duty-free, if he's getting special access
China.
to something in my country, all of you can demand that. Now, what does that mean for a small country like Vietnam? Right? Yeah. And now maybe that won't come to pass. Maybe what can happen, because after all we're talking about territory here, right? So if you're talking about territory, the government can always say, sorry, a special economic zone is a special economic zone, it's territory in our land, there will be no special administrative zone. It will be purely an economic zone, which has its own problems, but the fact is that if I'm giving you access with special privileges, then tomorrow you'll say, why am I not getting them? And you can hold up those negotiations, you can hold up other investment. And I think this is one of the big dangers of what shall I call it? It's not even a mosaic, it's a jumble. It's this jumble of free trade and investment agreements, They're all one on top of another. There's a lot of discussion about regulatory coherence across these agreements. And what does regulatory coherence mean? Regulatory coherence has a standard, it's almost like a checklist. So I can, they'll say land acquisition in the case of investment. They'll say FDI, liberalization, FDI has to be allowed, full repatriation, tax holidays, repatriation of exchange rate. Then they'll say a big part of this is, of course, what they call investor rights protection, which is supporting the investments of the investor as well as investors' rights. So supporting the investors is, for example, that if, say, Ayantika is investing in my country, and say Ankit is also, and Ankit is Indian and Ayantika is not, if I have to give Ayantika the same treatment I give Ankit. So meaning it's the non-discrimination rule, right? So which carries its own problems when you're trying to develop domestic industry and domestic industrialization, and you're trying to develop domestic services, because historically governments have used that. No, you use economic policy and you use sort of so-called development and trade and investment to develop your own industries and your own services and your own infrastructure. But if I have to give every foreign investor the same treatment as I'm giving a domestic investor, then that issue of that potential of using capital investment and other types of investment from domestic investors to develop the country, that goes out of the window. That's no longer valid then, right? So that's one part of the investor protection. But the other part, which is very, very scary, of course, is what they call investor state dispute settlement, ISDS. This is there in every contemporary FTA now, every trade and investment agreement. Investors have rights, and these rights have to be protected. Once the agreement is signed, the state must stick by the letter of whatever has been agreed, and if the investment rules are changed, the investor can take the government to court. They will take them into arbitration or court. There are two spaces. One is in the World Bank, the ICSID, the International Center for Settlement of Industrial Disputes. Is it center or council? ICSID is center. Yeah, International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. The other one is in the UN. It's called UNCITRAL, United Nations Council for International Tribunal, United Nations
Tribunal on Trade Law.
UNCITRAL, UNCITRAL. That's So these are two of the places where, at most common places where an investor can take a case, and this has already started happening. Even Laos is being sued, Thailand is being sued, Philippines is being sued. I think even Australia was sued was it Philip Morris or somebody, for putting health warnings on cigarettes. So basically, what an investor can do is an investor can say that any action taken by the government that prevents the investor from reaching the maximization of its profits and its revenues can be considered a barrier and a hindrance to investment. It can be considered discrimination. So they can bring it. Similarly, we have a lot of infrastructure is PPP, public-private partnership, and in public-private partnerships, these are mostly privatization projects where governments are now increasingly allowing the investors to basically say whatever they need, in order to be able to recoup their investment, right? And in a situation like this, suppose there's a big toll road, and the government allows the investors to set the toll fees. And later on, there is a detrimental effect of that in terms of trucking, say medicinal supplies, getting agricultural goods into market. There are various reasons. I mean, you don't use the road for so many things, right? Is there coffee there?
Coffee, sir.
No, there's coffee.
There is coffee.
Okay, I'll wait for mine. I'll wait for the button. Oh, thank you.
Black is black tea or
Yeah, and
Black tea.
Delicious.
Sweet black. Yeah, I can have black coffee. Black coffee.
so China only has 3 SEZs which are in the question, right?
I'm sorry?
Which China's 3 SEZs are are controversial in that sense, because everyone else is demanding the same treatment, right?
This is an example. This is in Vietnam. This is in Vietnam. Now, those SEZ have not yet been agreed, but they're in the negotiation process. That's just in Vietnam.
Okay.
But China is an investor in many other SEZs also. So
And the entire region.
in the entire region, in all of it, across Asia, Okay. So, yeah, so that's, So that's ISDS, okay. Oh yeah, I was talking about the toll road. So in the case of the toll road, so you suppose the government says the toll is too high. You have to reduce the toll. Or no more toll. Or you have to, no toll on agricultural produce. Or, those types of things. Or no toll on public buses, for example. The company can say, you are interfering in our profits. So basically, any action that a government would take that could reduce, could, and not even will, could be perceived and interpreted as a measure that prevents the investor from getting their full profit, can be considered a violation of investor rights. So now what has happened is, in the few cases, actually it's more than a few, but they're not advertised that much, that's why I'm saying few cases, because just a few hit the headlines, that where the information is coming out, the onus of proof is on the state. So if I'm an investor and I bring a case against a government, it's the government that has to prove that they have not done, that they're not interfering in my profits. And these cases they're long drawn out. Corporations are rich, they're wealthy, they have power, they have access to batteries of lawyers, they've prepared all this. Also, many of these investors are tied along with trade and investment agreements. Many of them are also tied with aid agreements. So for example, bilateral aid, overseas development assistance. A lot of that now has contracts for investors. So you see, it's been a common thing for a long time that when heads of state visit each other, another plane goes with the whole economic community, and the chambers of commerce will go, all the investors will go, right? It's a road show. So these are all basically economic bazaar road shows where, the head of state, the diplomacy really has much more to do with economics and economic interest than it does have to do with policy and politics and, maintaining peace and democracy and those types of things, right? So that's another chilling effect for governments. So a government would be a lot less likely to try to get an investor to follow its own rules if that investor comes from a country that's giving it a lot of aid. So again, this is where a country like China becomes really important, because China is giving huge amounts of aid to most of the mainland Southeast Asia countries, right? So for all the way from Myanmar, include to Vietnam also, although there have been historical political foes, massive amounts of aid across the region. And it gives this aid without conditionalities, quote unquote. I'm putting them in quotation marks because it will always take something back. It just won't put them as policy conditionalities, So they, Korea did the same, South Korea did the same, Japan did the same, and now China's doing it. And, these types of direct investments are very welcomed by, Lee, thanks. So these are welcomed by the host government. Because, when they sign a World Bank agreement, they have policy conditions there. Now, of course, the whole finance scenario has changed quite a bit. So the old days of the way, the older days, not really the old, slightly older days of how the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank got their loans repaid, those have changed a bit. But the policy conditions have not changed. The policy ambience and the climate has not changed. So then you have a big country like China with a lot of money, which says, okay, what do you need? You need 5 bridges? We can do that for you. We'll get that to you, we'll build that for you. We'll build those. What do you, we don't want any. They'll say, they build it, they'll give them what they call a soft interest loan and so on and so forth, or a no interest loan. They'll have the conditions that they will put will not be policy conditions. They will not have anything to do with governance. They will not have anything to do with change your laws to allow tariff-free products. No, it will just basically be that our people can come into your country, they can work, We have access to your land, we have access to your trees, we have access to your resources, we have access to this mine. It's very straight up, it's very transactional and simple. So for governments that need cash or that need this infrastructure built, and they're getting loans from elsewhere, this is very, very welcome. So they get into these agreements, but then when there's a problem with that investor, they are on a very weak wicket. They're just completely unable to handle that negotiation at that time because China can pull out all its aid or Korea can pull out all its aid, and then what will they do? And so on. There are no human rights dialogues, there are no democracy dialogues, there are no discussions in parliament about democracy deficits. And those are also problematic. I'm not saying that sort of Western liberal way is the way to go. I don't have a solution about the perfect way to go. But, each of these approaches has its, downsides. So this is where the investor-state relationship has become really very, very important to understand. Because it involves finance and it involves politics. Now this is at the level of trade and investment agreements. Then we have FDI, foreign direct investment. And that often goes in the form of either plantations, or timber extraction, mining, other extractive industries, or other mega infrastructure development, which is just going crazy across Asia. Massive, big infrastructure. It's really gone rampant. And the interesting is academic way of putting it, but the scary thing about it is that a lot of the time, it's not clear what this infrastructure is for and what it's supposed to actually do. Because, our, maybe it's a slightly romantic idea of infrastructure, that even a road is supposed to take you from somewhere to somewhere. Infrastructure, you build infrastructure, you put it together so that people in that society have access to something by which they can improve their lives, right? But just this infrastructure, when a country becomes a truck stop for resources to be extracted from one country far away and then taken to another country far away, you sort of try to understand what is the purpose of this infrastructure. So I think, so now when we look at what is the purpose of this infrastructure, well, one is actually moving resources because of this, mushrooming of the global value chain model. So this global value chain form of production is sort of this next level of unbundling, breaking up production. So, Adani can take coal from Australia and can bring coal from Australia to India, right? They will process it in India and they will sell that energy to Bangladesh, In the case of garments, in the case of computers, in the case of telephones, global value chains are, everywhere. And in fact, half the time we don't even know which land has been violated where for this particular phone, or for this watch. We have no idea because we don't know where does the crystal come from. Where does this metal come from? Where does this steel come from? We have absolutely no idea. So these global products are really global products, and these sort of global value chains, they leave, they leave a huge wake of destruction behind them. One of the big, so the destruction, of course, part of the destruction is in the extraction itself and what's happening to the land and the territory and the resources. But it's also what's happening to workers at work. That's one of the biggest issues now, which is more and more groups are looking at it. But the consistent creation of this precariat, the precarious working conditions where unionization is not possible, workers are alienated across the chain. They can't, there was a time when at least workers would be, what's the word for it? They would be identified with a particular sector. So there was a certain sense of pride that they're bringing a product to the market, Now with global value chains, that's gone. So infrastructure plays a huge role in that. And here it's physical infrastructure, but also digital infrastructure and financial infrastructure. Financial infrastructure is again very, very huge there. The other big purpose, I think, of mega infrastructure actually is profit making, financial profit making. So I subscribe to a financial list called Asian Finance. It's a private sector, whatever. I pretended I was a micro enterprise and I signed up. So I get their updates and stuff. I don't read each and everything, but I can click and go on their website. And it's really fascinating to see, that it's a world that someone like me would never see. It's a world of creating different asset classes. It's a world of creating green bonds, using the green economy to finance infrastructure, to use the green economy to finance renewables, to use green bonds to finance other global value chains on energy. The language is entirely different, And there's big money to be made. The amount of money that they talk about in these, and it's a trade website, not a website. Yeah, website I suppose. It's trade in the sense not trading, but a finance trade. It's a financier's website. I suppose like one of those Fortune 500 places or whatever. I haven't seen those websites. So there's massive amounts of money to be made in infrastructure, and infrastructure is there in energy. It's there in roads, it's there in ports, in the transportation, it's there of course in property, real estate, anywhere there's mega infrastructure, waste and sanitation, shipping and so on. And again, huge amounts of money. So very often, some of the people that we work with say increasingly, even policymakers, that actually the project itself is not important. The project is the money. So it's the money to be made from that project that is important. It doesn't matter that you build a special economic zone and a development, of however thousands of acres, or 500 hectares or 1,000 hectares, and you wonder who's going to live in it. It doesn't matter, because the person who's bid for it has made their money, and then along the chain, there's a whole economy of people making money along these mega infrastructure chain. It's a value chain of itself, except that's not so alienated. It's only as alienated as money actually gets in today's world. No?
So how does, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
You
No,
finish it, then
maybe
I'll ask
go.
the question.
Go ahead.
No, but so you are saying that the purpose of the project is not important. There's whether it gets fulfilled or not. There's money to be made just in the implementation of the project. How does that work exactly? I mean, isn't it? I mean, there's something that some return that is expected, right, out of any investment. How does this work then?
It's true that return would be expected when they are trying to get the financing organized for the project. So in order to get financing organized, you have to get, you'll have to get different banks who give you the loans, and then those banks will have to that will be underwritten by another Exim bank or some other kind of export credit agency or some other bank, right? At that stage, yes. But if across Southeast Asia, there are these, not exactly abandoned projects, but there are these projects that are just not moving forward. And you talk to the investors, and very cagey about it, you can't actually get to talk to them. The government is clueless. Yeah, they'll come back sometime and they'll do it. So the question is, who's paid for this? And lots of little scams, which end up becoming big scams, that people put money into this, they got this land, they acquired the land, they were supposed to put a plantation there, they vanished for 5 or 6 years, but their lease is for 50 years or 99 years. But they got the land and they vanished. Now what are they going to do with it, right? A special economic zone is built. Who's coming to invest there? The casinos have been built. Who's coming? No one's coming there. So what was the purpose of putting that? And when we talk to the chamber, try to get information from the chambers of commerce, it's very interesting that either there's very little information available or they don't want to share it. My guess is that if you're not a member of the chamber of commerce, they're not going to want to share it. I mean, they're not just going to let some random researcher find out about it.
If I can just add
Yeah,
another example. You know, a lot of times the investment is not commercial. For instance, the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. You know, when it was being built, you had enough analysis saying that you don't need this port, it's not going to be viable. But China just gave, I mean, lobbied with the Rajapaksa government, gave soft loans with hardly any interest. And finally, when the port was built, we had some 30 odd ships every year, and Sri Lanka couldn't pay the debt. Now the whole port has been handed to China. China owns the port for 99 years. They also own 15,000 acres around the port, and it's strategic reasons.
Yeah.
So China's got control over
In Sri Lanka?
that area. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's called the Hambantota port, which Sri Lanka had to hand over to China because they couldn't service the debt.
Yeah.
Not just the port, but like I said, 15,000 acres.
All
around
the
port.
area, yes.
Newly built.
Really? Oh, absolutely.
Same also happened in other places, Maldives and other
Yeah.
places. That's what
There's a
China-
Nigeria.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is not, nobody wants
Uh,
control over that.
yeah, and then, if we, yeah, you can get to the BR.
Yeah, right, road.
BDM is in-
So sometimes, sorry.
Mhm.
So that's what I mean, Mansi, by, you know, what is the actual purpose of this investment, you know? Why is it actual, of this particular infrastructure, you know? And I think the financial gains, just from actually getting that investment moving, is huge. Because when you see how money is raised for them, through bonds and so on, it's a way of getting people to take their money out of savings accounts and move them into a money market. In fact, SBI told me that. My dear beloved SBI in Bangalore recently told me, because I asked them, trying to clarify, what does capital gains tax really mean if a property you're selling has not gained? I said, if there's no capital gain, then you still have to pay capital gains tax. And they said, yeah. The only way you don't have to pay capital gains tax is you have to, in 5 years, you have to either put it into another property or you buy into a government bond. And I said, what is which government bond? And they said, there are some special particular, and one of them is the India infrastructure. So you buy into Indian government's infrastructure, but if you invest in those bonds, 5 years is all they're asking you, 5 or 6 years. And after that, you can take your money out and they won't charge you capital gains tax. So my question then was that, so what is it that the government is getting out of this, our government? Of course, the government wants taxation and revenue, and as a good citizen, I'm perfectly willing to pay my share of the taxation because I would rather that citizens have a stake in the public finance of a country. But this whole idea that the government will create particular bonds on particular sectors, and those are the ones from which they give you redemption from capital gains. And that's an interesting one. In fact, I was going to ask CFA people to look into this more, or I was going to ask for all your advice, whether you know about what these bonds are. I haven't looked at them, but I can find out also, but we can look into those. So, so this is another trend that we're seeing, the FDI. Another big trend, of course, are special economic zones. Now, special economic zones have made a comeback, a massive comeback in the last, I would say, maybe 10, 15 years. And, special economic zones are not new. In the 70s and 80s, in Latin America, they were there, and other places. It's an old, yeah. But then for a while they died down. Then in mainland Southeast Asia, Asian Development Bank and ASEAN started to push them. And after the Berlin Wall came down, and the Mekong region was being sold. They said now that the war is over, the Indochina war is over, Khmer Rouge is out, Paris Peace Accords have happened. This area is now, Berlin Wall has come down, everybody's moving towards a liberal democracy and market economy, blah, blah, blah. So a good time for reinvesting, right? So take massive resources of the Mekong region all the way from Myanmar to Vietnam for investment. So they started pushing this what they call the GMS, the Greater Mekong Sub-Regional Economic Cooperation, which is basically, it's the vision there is to make the Mekong region one massive SEZ. They have economic corridors and various infrastructure things and so on. But then these special economic zones were also being pushed by ASEAN and other countries across Southeast Asia. There was this thing called the Bimpiaga, which was Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines. There was the Sojor Triangle, which was between Sojor in Indonesia and Brunei, and so there were those. I think some of you might remember, or at least Joe and Benny, you might remember. In South Asia, there was the SAGQ, the South Asia Growth Quadrangle. Then there was the BIMSTEC. And when we were
And SASEC.
SASEC came, yes, South Asia. Yeah, SASEC came after South Asia Growth Quadrangle. Yeah, Central Asia, they had CAREC, the Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation. So this was all basically creating these special investment zones. But they call them special economic zones. But the idea was that governments will cede a part of their territory to create a special investment zone where all bets are off. So these are again like your extraterritorial concessions. So this is where, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, we come back full circle. This is where the policy coherence becomes important. Because if countries in one region, even if they don't share a border together, if it's a region, so for example, say Vietnam and Myanmar don't share a border together. Vietnam and Thailand don't share a border together, right? But if they are to be part of the same regional economic arrangement, their policies have to align with each other. So this is where all those, they make all these agreements for policy coherence about taxation and land acquisition. They call them, for labor, they call them no industrial action. So basically unionization is prevented and so on. And in special economic zone propers, which we have been studying quite a bit, and we have publications on our website, you can download them. We've done, what we're doing is trying to see, we're sneaking inside because we have close friends in the Mekong region and in the Philippines and other areas. We're quite close to, shall I say, workers' movements. So those who are trying to unionize inside quietly, they help us to get access. And we've been interviewing people. And the conditions of work are dangerous, risky, and bad. So work conditions are bad in terms of precariousness, occupational safety, and the wages and the conditions and where people live. Then there's a political aspect, and that is that they're not allowed to unionize. They're not given full contracts. Because labor laws in most countries still say that if you have a full 1-year contract, it's a regular contract. So you give them 8-month contracts. You give them 8-month contracts, you give them no benefits, you give them nothing. No? And the arguments that the producers make, the contractors in the SEZ make, is that we have to keep costs low. If it's not cost effective for us, we cannot invest. And this argument continues. This race to the bottom argument continues. And the governments agree. And so the workers continue to get exploited. And if they do try to come together, they are blacklisted. So, workers, their photographs will be taken, they'll be fired from one worker, but in the entire SEZ, that person's photograph will be put up, and the name, etc. And no contractor in that SEZ will hire this person. So, the ways in which workers are being oppressed are, they're clever, they're tricky, and the problem is they're all legal. So this is again a part of the no industrial action policy coherence, right? So this is one entire area. And now into all this mix comes the China's Belt and Road Initiative. Into this big plethora, into this swamp of various amphibians and reptiles is the Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road, which was launched in, I think, 2013. And it is really one of the most massive investment ideas in the world. But the interesting thing about the BRI, because I've been reading a lot about the BRI, because people we work with in Myanmar, Cambodia, Philippines, Laos, they ask us to explain to them what is this, who are these Chinese investors, right? And the people that we're trying to explain this to are not NGOs. They're people from unions, they're farmers, they're peasants, they're fisher folk, or they're urban poor groups, trying to understand who are these people. So, we read a lot to try to understand, to make sense of it ourselves, and say, who are these people and why is the BRI so powerful? And there's even a BRI podcast. It's called Voices of the Belt and Road. So I listened to that. It's available in many different languages, so, because, and it made me realize that the BRI is extremely popular. That's one. Another thing is that the BRI is not a project. It's a concept. It's an idea. It's, so this is this vision that it's a part cultural vision and it's a part self-righteous vision, that China is finally going to reclaim its central place in the world as a world power, So in order to do that, economics isn't enough, and it's not going to do that by brute force. It's not going to do that the way the United States did it, or Europe did it. It's going to do that through well-being. Seriously, I mean, I'm friends of mine who read Chinese read it out to me and they explain to me, and I go, wow, okay. But there's a whole philosophy. What can I tell you? It's a doctrine. So they're going to do it through culture, through well-being, through harmony, through peacefulness, and so on. So the Belt and Road, there's many Belt and Roads. So there's the physical Belt and Road, right, which is the old Silk Road, right, so that you've seen. Then there's the Maritime Silk Road. Maritime Silk Road is where the port in Sri Lanka is very important. The port in Karachi, Andamans, the ones that they want to build in Burma, the port that they have built in Malaysia. All these are very, very important. It's part of the Maritime Silk Road. And then going to Madagascar and, going up from there. So that's the maritime route, right? In Greece is also part of that. Then that's two. Then the third is there's a digital Silk Road. Digital Silk Road is setting up digital centers. And how do you say, making sure that internet technology and technological sort of advancement is promoted. So China is actually financing a lot of computer schools, a lot of Chinese firms of mobile phones, and this whole expansion of Chinese technology in electronics is going there. Then the issue of Paytm, digital payments, money, commerce, all that is part of the e-commerce part of it. And then there's the cultural Silk Road. And the cultural is setting up Confucian centers, scholarships, cultural halls, etc. So, it's a massive, massive concept. And of course, the side of it that we see the most is the infrastructure, the physical one, because that, and they have massive amounts of money. There's a Silk Road Fund with a initial capitalization of $40 billion. The AIIB, China has put a bunch of money into that. Then in the New Development Bank, also China has put a bunch of capitalization into that, saying it will help with the BRI. China has started the Lanchang Mekong Cooperation, which they say will improve the ADB's GMS. So, there's a massive, massive amount of money. And they leave the BRI open as a concept, saying anybody can be a part of the BRI. So, for example, in Cambodia, the port that is technically a part of BRI is in the province of Kokong. But if you go to a Kokong, K-O-H-K-O-N-G, that's where the big deep sea port is. But if you go to another province just next to that called Sihanoukville, that entire area is a Chinese enclave. I mean, I can show you photographs on my from my computer if you want. I mean, it's pretty shocking when you see what's happened to that area. And that place is not technically part of BRI, but now more and more signs have started coming out to show, you know, in Chinese and Khmer to say BRI embraces. You know, it's an embracing concept, so you can all be part of it. And at a recent talk, you know, one of the Chinese academics was saying, yes, India does not want to be part of BRI now, but in the future, why would it not want to be part of BRI? So you can be part of BRI anyway, you know. You don't have to be a part of the investment. And a lot of European financial houses are very, very interested in BRI because they think that it's a huge investment opportunity, massive investment opportunity, because it's so huge, and with the 4 pillars, no? The land, the Silk Road, the maritime, digital, and the cultural. There are so many opportunities, they say, for business development. Small enterprise development, hedge funds, financiers. You know, there's... I'm sorry?
Security firms to guard.
Technology firms.
Security. Those,
Oh, security firms, yeah.
Huge.
So it's not seen as a threat. You know, in most countries, it's not seen as a threat. It's seen as, you know, here China is creating all these opportunities, and China is saying that we are creating opportunities. The world is in depression. You know, there's a global economic recession. We are creating the opportunities. See, and we're doing this in the Chinese way. And for the local people who do get jobs, right, they say, yeah, that's true. Our government is not doing anything to give us jobs. And we're getting these jobs. But then there's the other side of it. Now you go in Malaysia, in Maluku, and I think Tocha, where the big deep sea port is, right? These 2 places. Again, the same thing has happened. Massive investment, very expensive port, deep sea port. The government can't afford it. They can't pay. So what do? They sell the port to a Chinese firm, and they use that money to repay a Chinese loan. No, but this has happened. And I read it and I said, there's something really wrong with this picture. What am I not getting right? And I read it, I asked other people, but that is exactly what's happened.
That's called China having its cake and eating it.
Yeah, having its cake and eating it too, absolutely, you know. And in Maluku, you take a look at it, after the talk, I mean, I can show you photographs if you want, or you can Google it. They're literally changing the landscape. They say, BRI is changing the landscape or changing the geography of the world, but literally, because they're building false islands. You know, they're building new islands in the sea, right? And then building these massive housing complexes. But the thing is, they're too expensive even for the most rich Malaysians to buy. So now what's happened is the Malaysians are praying that the Chinese will come and invest, buy those, because they're saying, if they don't come, what will we do? All our land is gone. The land is gone. So imagine the Malaysian joint venture firms who went into partnership with the Chinese developers. They're actually now waiting for Chinese to come. And these are not, by the way, we're not talking about 35, 40 flat structures, huh? These are massive townships, you know. The same things happen in Senukville in Cambodia. Same things about to happen in Karachi. It's happening in a number of different places, you know. These massive, massive structures. In the middle of Laos, in the middle of Vientiane, an entire swamp, it's wetland, it's called a swamp, an entire wetland. It's Chinese housing, luxury housing. All the signs, everything are in Chinese. Now no Chinese have come so far, or very few have come. The Lao people can't afford it. So the Lao joint venture people are saying the same thing, that, you know, if the Chinese businesses, rich families don't come and buy these, they said our band is bajaud. Because what will we do, right? What are you going to do with this? Because people have sunk money into it. And this again brings me, Mansi, to the earlier point that I think to myself, what was the purpose of all this? Somebody's made some money, right? So, and I guess in real estate this is very tricky, right? How people make money and then vanish. So BRI is, this is one whole side of BRI, that we're seeing. There's a lot of conflict that has started up now in Pakistan. So, one big part of the land BRI is from Karachi to across Central Asia. And that's where the Caspian oil is, that's where the Baku-Shehan pipeline is. And so, of course, it's not surprising that there are many theories that the BRI is also a military strategy. Because what China is doing through this is it's securing resources. It's getting oil, it's getting minerals, it's getting land, it's getting the crystals it needs, etc. Okay. It already has the labor, so no problem there. It already has a lot of capital, which it has gotten through various ways. So there are some problems. It's had a financial crisis, but it's still somehow moving things along, right? But then, when you look at the deep sea ports, especially, there's an old theory called the string of pearls theory.
Yeah.
It's been around for a while, because when you look at the ports that were envisaged by China's military a long time ago, it was like a string of pearls like that, right? So many of the more strategic analysts are saying that the BRI is sort of reviving the string of pearls theory. So if you look at the deep sea ports, starting from the South China Sea, go to Malaysia, then you come around into the Indian Ocean. They'll have one in Myanmar, and then they already have the one in Sri Lanka, and then they'll have in Karachi. They have one in Greece. I forgot the name. It starts before Macedonia. There's an island there. I've forgotten the name of it. Anyways, I'm getting old. I can't remember the name. So there's also that part of that this is also a military strategy, right? But then I kind of think about it, and I said, yeah, but if you're a superpower, of course you'll have a military strategy, right? No superpower is only going to sit around and do meditation. They're going to do all these things. I'm not excusing it. I'm just saying that for me this is not a surprising thing that this would happen. But there's massive amounts of money there. But then what happens is it sets off a race. So some friends of ours who are Japanese analysts who work closely with the Japanese government told us that when they talk to their government has said that their government is really not interested in an SEZ in Myanmar. What they want to avoid at all costs is for China to get a deep sea port. If China gets a deep sea port, they will build a deep sea port. So eventually who suffers? You're sort of setting off an escalation, right? I think the Indian government will do the same. If China gets deep sea ports, India will also go deep sea ports. India will not allow China to build its deep sea ports in the Indian Ocean without staking its own claim, no? So again, you see a sort of a, domino effect, no? Something is triggered and set off. So, okay, can I stop here on this very encouraging note? And can we have a discussion? I know this is not exactly finance, but it is very finance. Because this is trade, investment, finance, it all comes together, and there's so much money involved.
Somewhere we had heard this counter-Japanese strategy. Somewhere with India to have maritime and other things. But not much is heard about. I mean, of course, China is going to counter. Japan is going to counter in terms of investments with China. They control now ADB. They control the current investments. They are the key partner of US in this region, and so it's very strategic with what Japan is going to do.
Yeah, but Japan is also not very solvent, no? To be honest, I'm not that well versed in on Japan's economy. But isn't Japan having financial issues? Many have you checked?
No,
recently?
I mean, what I've also heard is there was an announcement.
Yes.
But clearly, Japan doesn't have the deep pockets that China has. Same with India. I mean, India is not joining the Belt Road, but it clearly doesn't have the capacity to do a counter. Impossible. At that scale. So so far it's just been talk that we'll also do something, but
But-
I don't think anything.
But in many areas, Japan has been a traditional, well, I call it an old investor. So say Myanmar, in Laos, across the Mekong region, Japan has been one of the biggest financiers of infrastructure, physical infrastructure like roads and so on and so forth. And right now in Cambodia, for example, a lot of the ports and the bridges and stuff are financed, are run and they were set up by Japan. So that infrastructure already exists. So yeah, it doesn't have as deep pockets as China, but they have certainly come out and said this, that if China does further investment, we will also do it. I mean, but it's in specific things like deep sea ports. And they are very worried. I think the Japanese are worried, I think the Koreans are worried, the Indians are worried.
No, Japanese are worried. That is why they've also started investing in the defense because of the military thing.
Yeah.
So it's visible now, that desperation in that sense.
And I mentioned security because apparently the firm that's been contracted out to guard a lot of the Belt Road Initiative projects, because for instance in Pakistan, it goes through those sort of disputed territories, Baltistan.
Yeah.
The insurgent groups in Pakistan have already said we're going to attack these projects. And the firm they've hired out to help guard these projects is that notorious private mercenary group called Blackwater. You know,
Oh,
Eric
yeah.
Prince, the guy who was running these private
Yeah.
armies in
Blackwater.
Afghanistan.
Blackwater changed its name, I think, to Dincor, no? Or something, yeah, but they've had, but the same group,
Hmm.
Blackwater.
I mean, that was mentioned
Yeah.
in, remember Atul spoke on the Belt Road
Yeah.
in a CFA meeting around the new development back, I think March it was there. He mentioned that. Because one
Yeah.
part of the narrative is that this is a project to counter US hegemony. And you have a lot of US firms who are part of
Yeah.
these initiatives. So it's quite complex in that way. It's not like the US or Europe versus China, because
No.
Europe is very much part of it. And like you said, many European countries see.
You know, there's a European BRI. You can Google it. There's actually a website which says either BRI Europe or Europe BRI or something, which basically is a place where, you know, it's an informational space for how European firms can participate in the BRI.
And
And
when you
if you-
talked of culture, there's a really hilarious Belt Road Initiative song.
Yeah.
Have
It
you
comes
seen
in
it?
John Oliver, no?
It's
Towards the end.
crazy. They've
With all
got
the
children
kids.
singing about the Belt Road Initiative.
And if any of you listen to podcasts, look for this, voices of the BRI or voices from the Belt and Road. It's really very interesting. You know, they keep adding. I only listen to the ones in English. There are Chinese and French and whatever. You know. So, yeah. So I think the BRI is definitely very, very complex. But the
So I
upshot
have
of
a
it.
question.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
I mean, linked to the point that India is not part of the Belt Road. Part of it is, you know, a typical Modi government response, you know, the anti-China. Do you think a coalition, sort of united front government might change its position? Because, I mean, for India, it's an infrastructure project. There's interest among a lot of firms to be part of it. Do you think India might join it if there's a change in regime, or India will still stay out?
Related to this, I mean, when India is not joining the BRI initiative, what is its other strategy? What is that India is doing of its own to counter this? I mean, is there some larger design which is kind of being developed, or are they waiting for the right opportunity and getting some resources, or what is it? Where is it all leading to? Because India cannot kind of stay aloof like this for too long, right?
Yeah.
Either it needs to join or it needs to kind of develop
Do
something
some-
of its
yeah.
own to counter it.
Yeah.
So where is it, which direction is it heading?
You know, I think one general observation that, a comment that I have based on observations that other people studying the BRI have mentioned to me, is that there is a belief among some people who are watching the BRI that this thing is going to collapse under its own weight. It's too big, you know? So it will not be actually a massive global project as people fear it to be, you know? Because many things are happening in the world, you know? And one country is not going to be able to mobilize the kind of capital to pull the entire world out of recession, etc. So that, so in a way people are getting a bit too paranoid. And maybe you'll have bits and pieces here and there. You'll have this port will happen, that port will happen. So one shouldn't be too panicky about it. So there is that aspect of it. Some people might be thinking, some of the governments might be thinking that too, that it's going to collapse under its own weight. And what we really need to worry about is that our strategic allies and our strategic spaces are not lost.
Independent relationships with the countries.
Independent, yeah. And if you look at what India is doing, for example,
Bhutan,
Nepal, Myanmar, India. When did India start its? It started its. Whether it was, it doesn't matter whether it's this government or the. Yeah, it doesn't matter whether it's this government or the previous government or whatever. But India did start reopen diplomatic relations with Myanmar when China was started to flex its muscles, no? So India is going to be probably much more cautious about where its strategic interests lie. What's it going to do about Pakistan, for example? That's a really, really tricky one. Because India's relations with Pakistan are really at an all-time low. And Pakistan has now got this massive influx of money from BRI. It's not going to get any more money from the United States, Pakistan that is. So it's a good time for India to make overtures to the United States. But the United States is in huge debt to China. So how all these geopolitics play themselves out. I don't think it's going to be in a linear way. I think the number of little things will pop up here and there. Similarly, I don't think Japan really cares what happens in some part of Africa. Japan cares that the South China Sea, the Spratlys, that whole area, the Indian Ocean area, places where Japan has had its interests, that those are not going to be controlled by China. So I think a lot of countries, the older superpowers or the existing superpowers, are probably going to pick their strategy, they're going to pick their battles. Because BRI really is a massive project.
Now, 600 projects.
Yeah, so now whether India, Japan, Korea are all going to say, okay, let's all become an anti-BRI club or something. I don't know, they could do it. But my guess is that they might want to, they'll pick their battles based on what is most strategic to them. I mean, from a geopolitical thing. And I think from the point of view, what will India do in terms of infrastructure? But is India actually lacking for funds for infrastructure? Because, we read reports on both sides, right? That one is that the mega infrastructure programs of India are now falling apart because there's no money. And no investors want to do the special investment areas, etc., etc. But at the same time, there are also the big Adanis and the Ambanis and the whoever, the big names, who are still getting licenses and moving forward. So I think friends from CFA could tell us more. What is India's position in terms of infrastructure finance?
But I asked more in terms of India's grasp on the region.
Yeah.
And like you rightly said, India opening up its trade relationship and diplomacy with this one. I mean, Maldives, they managed to kind of.
Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka, I don't know, is it?
It will watch very carefully now with this new crisis.
So I mean, it's in that context I was asking what
yeah.
India is doing. Not that India needs any. I mean, it's not that India needs any
finance. Yeah. Yeah. From that point of view, I think what I've seen India doing, what I understand it is picking its battles and saying, okay, where is it strategically, most? Where is it strategically most interested? I think definitely it's going to be very, very strategically interested in the eastern coast of Africa and the entire Indian Ocean. So I don't think it's going to allow China to go uncontested or unchallenged there. I think another thing that India has, which sounds odd, but it's just my little, how should I say, thought sometimes, is that India has its own version of a cultural Silk Road, and that is the massive Indian diaspora. One of the things that's happened with the BRI and Chinese investment overseas, outside Chinese borders, is the movement of people. So Chinese projects go with Chinese workers. And when Chinese workers go, they stay. So it's not like they go and they come back necessarily, right? And they stay there for a long time. And there's a lot of resentment to that. And the resentment is, part of it is class-based, because, in many places people are willing to accept the bourgeoisie or the middle or upper classes who spend in a certain way and live in a certain way. They don't want Chinese peasants, they don't want Chinese construction workers, They don't want people who eat that smelly food and, that kind of thing. There's a lot of, how should I say, racism and xenophobia there, but it's there. And moving people is a part of the strategy. So many years, even up 12 years ago, since 15 years ago, in meetings between Chinese scholars and others that we would have in the region, the discussion would often be among the Chinese scholars, not whether China should send its farmers to Africa, but how often and how it should send them. Because they had already assumed that people in Africa needed to be taught how to farm. And Chinese farmers would teach them how to farm. And that somehow would, become a way of helping the Chinese economy. So, what you're seeing, what happens when you have a huge influx of another race is the demographics change, right? So when the local demographics change, there's a lot of social instability and so on. And I think one of the things that India relies on, and that's why India is willing to work on, Mode 4. I mean, it's why it's willing to work on the movement of Indian professionals abroad in international trade and investment agreements, because I think Indians do sort of see that as or the governments see that as a form of diplomacy. Indians become acceptable. India becomes acceptable. India is an old civilization. Indians are knowledgeable. Upper class Indians consume the way the West does. And anyway, with the globalization of production, more or less everybody's consuming the same. Everybody's ordering, not everybody, but a lot of the middle classes are ordering from Flipkart and Amazon and whatever. People are consuming the same types of things, which may all be made in China, but they're being sold by an American firm. So I think in this cultural war thing, I wonder sometimes, whether this is our...
And it's a win-win situation for India. One is that you're getting remittances, and they're the perfect fodder for the right-wing project.
Yes, absolutely.
Indians who go abroad are like sort of ultra-nationalist rather than...
Yeah, because they kind of forget, they have this romanticized idea of an India in cotton wool. Some old Akhand Bharat of God knows which century.
And with this influx of all these funds coming in and also the easy movement of global capital, I mean, of course, they are weaned and I mean, their powers are this thing. Are the traditional NDBs going to be completely obsolete? I mean, or, I mean, as you mentioned in the beginning, would they kind of focus more influencing on policies on things like that? And the traditional role of NDBs are, I mean, is it going to kind of completely change and they become completely obsolete? I mean, why should these governments go after these institutions with all their so-called great safeguard policies and this and another? When all this money easy coming, why should the governments kind of go through such pain? I mean, are they going to kind of in the near future, in the foreseeable future, are they going to be kind of completely going to get obsolete?
Good question. But you remember, Joe, we had discussed this issue regarding the World Bank several years ago. When one time we were sitting in a discussion, when the debate, when there was the discussion was sort of oriented that did the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, did the IFC expand because of the massive expansion of private capital? Or did private capital expand because of IFC? And I think many of us thought that it was actually IFC being, the World Bank being opportunistic because they saw the writing on the wall, right? So when you have massive amounts of private capital going anywhere, what does the World Bank do? It takes its floundering IFC, I mean, not floundering, IFC was never that big, no? But you remember there was a time it suddenly started to mushroom with those financial intermediaries, etc., etc. It found a way to challenge private capital into quote-unquote developmental purposes, which sort of were also not matched, but it accompanied the rise of this philanthrocapitalism or capital of whichever way we want to call it, right? So my sense is that these MDBs will do that. Like Asian Development Bank, you can already see it. When you read its infrastructure report, it's dreadfully boring reports, but when you go through them and you see, what they're advocating, basically what they're doing is they're cashing in on what's already happening. They're riding on its coattails, no? And trying to make themselves relevant. And I think there's a double self-interest there. So the institution itself will try to keep itself relevant by riding on the coattails of a more powerful force. And at the same time, the governments will allow that to happen because no government wants to make itself irrelevant. Even although our governments are re-regulating in the interest of private capital, they still call it public interest, right? They call it public interest, they call it public goods, but it's all private capital. It's public-private partnership, but it's privatization, right? They'll use eminent domain to get what they want for themselves. So governments don't want to make themselves irrelevant because if governments make themselves irrelevant, who will support capital then? Then what do you go back to? You go back to those old mercantile states or something, no? So I think there's quite a lot of opportunism there, frankly. But, I'm not smart enough to give you a full analysis of that, I'm sorry.
And infrastructure is a bit like a golden goose. There's never enough of it. You just need to keep building. Even if it's not required, people are just building. And all of these institutions will still be relevant because, you might not be a hegemonic player like the World Bank was in the 80s or the EDB around that time for Asia. But you'll be one of the players. You'll still be useful as a source of funds, as a source of knowledge. And strategically reinvent themselves. It seems like the infrastructure sort of, and you have all these bogus figures about the infrastructure gap.
Yeah, it's completely bogus.
And it's in trillions.
Yeah.
So all of them then, they churn out data to reinforce their existence.
Yes.
And they just keep doing that.
And they're self-referential. So when you look at a lot of these reports and you read their references, they're just quoting each other.
Yeah. No, and apparently the AIIB is full of World Bank and EDB staff in any case.
Yeah.
They've all moved ship
The funny part is the figures are always different. I mean, like, so World Bank says A, then AIB must be saying B, and like it's like no consensus even among themselves that how much money is actually needed that way.
And eventually it's just like lots.
Yeah.
So just keep at
Just
it. And
pumping.
this goes back again to this point that why so much infrastructure? Who needs all this? And for what? And the other question, of course, is when you look at it very, very practically, with all this money going in, with so many years of overseas development assistance, so much money that has gone into this or that or the other, the world is still as poor as ever. Quality of life has worsened so badly. The immiseration that people live in today is so much worse than any other time. Even if we have a bigger middle class and a bigger middle consuming class, it's so, the paradigm seems to be that wealth cannot be created without a simultaneous creation of poverty and immiseration. And that's shocking. So that completely flies in the face of any developmentalism, So, so they don't really care, nah? They'll just keep putting this here and then. They failed. And I think one of the things that I wanted to add here as a trend, which is not exactly a financial trend, but sort of is a general trend, is this rise of multi-stakeholderism. It's really multi-stakeholderism and criminalization. So, well, in India, of course, we all know what criminalization, anybody who stands up, anybody who has a heterodox view, you stand up for your rights, you stand up for collective rights, you critique the government, off with your head, right? And all this is legal. It's criminalization because it's legal. When they can't use legal things, they use extra legal. Somebody will shoot at you or beat you up, or look at the level of violence that's increased, right? Yes, there's a lot of luck, and India is a caste-ridden, entrenched country, but there's a lot of economic interest there too. Behind these types of violence. You look at Southeast Asia, it's really, really bad. I mean, in terms of both criminalization and extrajudicial. So, it's absolutely not possible anymore. I mean, people do it, but there's so many laws, cybercrime laws, defamation laws, treason laws, anti-sedition laws, across mainland Southeast, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, that people are being arrested willy-nilly, literally, and being put away for really long periods of time, no due process. Their funds are cut off, and so all those things that's happening. And where legal apparatus doesn't work, they use other violence, threats, shootings, beating people up, rape, sexual harassment. And so, how do you say that the brute force, that level of brute force has increased. And then simultaneous along with this is this rise of this multi-stakeholderism. That, so corporations are not legally accountable. You have codes of conduct, you have CSR, and the same types of protections, legal protections that are available for investors, like ISDS, is not available for communities, it's not available for workers. So when it comes to them, they have to be protected by arbitration or voluntary codes. But when it comes to investors and large capital, they are protected by hard law. I think India is one of the few countries where we can still sue a corporation. Law still exists to do that. No?
No, but in India during the civil nuclear deal, there was this huge issue on the liability clause. So America wanted, especially the GE wanted to waive it off, but I don't really know what is the case now. It's been almost a decade now.
Yeah.
So, but then what is this? I mean, do the corporations have this protection from the liability suit? Suppose if any industrial disaster happens in the region that you're talking about.
Well, in Thailand, they've pretty much got away with it. Only recently, there have been 2 cases where the administrative courts ruled against a massive corporation on mining contamination. And that is really, really surprising, because since the current regime is very pro-capital. And that's the other thing that, Benny and we were discussing, right, Benny, that we have the anti-globalization from the right wing, from the conservative forces. But these conservative forces are very pro-capital. They're pro-capital, they're neoliberal, so they speak the language of nationalism, they speak the language of parochialism, whatever, but they're completely pro-capital. There's nothing there for the citizenry, There's nothing there for local communities and well-being.
And just to add to your point about multi-stakeholderism, the World Economic Forum is meeting now, I think from tomorrow for the next few days. And it's a concept pushed by the WEF, basically recognizing that intergovernmental efforts are not, providing access to markets. So the WTO has collapsed, the UN climate talks are not sort of pushing the green economy as fast as it could. You have, in terms of big tech, again, so one of the things that the WEF is attempting to launch at this edition is the link to the earlier point you made, the plurilateral on e-commerce.
Oh.
So again, you don't have a global agreement for big tech to access markets, get access to data. So it's basically Facebook, Google, Apple sitting together with client governments, US and Europe, and now China, because China also has its big tech, and subverting all kinds of intergovernmental processes to say that let corporations and sort of intellectuals, academics, and governments meet, and the multi-stakeholder approach is on a range of issues. So they've got multi-stakeholder forums on the future of food, the future of trade, on urban areas, on, name it, they have it. Health, for instance. So they've got some 21 multi-stakeholder forums, which unfortunately are populated by some NGOs also. Because the multi-stakeholder approach is NGOs, business and government, and academics. So if you go to the WEF website, you'll see these multi-stakeholder forums, and you'll see some of our friends in it, like WWF.
Yes.
I think there's an NGO from India also that's in it, which works on agriculture. This guy who's from Punjab, who sits in the Punjab government's. This is Balram Jakar's son.
Oh.
Ajay Jakar. He's inside the future of agriculture multi-stakeholder forum. There are all kinds of things. I think there are lots of Indians inside some of this. But it's basically an attempt to subvert intergovernmental policy making and bring in business to speed up things. So they're saying we don't need a free trade agreement. Let's look at other ways to push market access.
There's not much of a conversation. I've been doing most of the talking.
You wanted to
Hey, come on. Other people got to say stuff too.
No, I was just thinking about something that you said in the beginning about, I still feel that this gap that is there in terms of what is happening at the policy level and, the battles that are on the ground, I think that it's only widening. I don't see it, kind of being, filled. And one of the things, like for instance, some of the questions that have come up, I think people like us are, really blank on that. Like for instance, what is happening with, let's say, all these infrastructure projects that are happening in states like Himachal, like the 4-laning roads and stuff like that. It's not moving forward. So what is the reason for it? Where is the money coming? Why is the money not coming? Why are they still going on announcing this whole thing of government wanting to keep itself relevance? I think we're not being able to, as far as the economics and the finance side is concerned, we're not being able to hit. I mean, that picture is not complete for people who are, activists on the ground. And I feel, I don't know what could be done to kind of find out what are the, places where we can intervene. I mean, we're doing it at one level, more, looking at environmental laws and looking at, okay, what are the mobilizing, consciousness building on the ground, that kind of stuff. But it still doesn't, in terms of policy, what is going on and who's actually working on it is something that's not clear to at least someone like me. I haven't clue what's going on, and I don't know where to kind of look for this.
Isn't there an
analysis.
Indian infrastructure board? There is. Like in Bangalore, I know where the Karnataka Infrastructure Board office is. Doesn't
There are
every,
state level boards for that.
there are, no?
Yeah, and like that your like GIDC, Gujarat Industrial Development Corporation. So that will determine mostly for the Gujarat, like what kind of projects will come, and like the companies have to, at the end, like in India, it's the state governments which determine
Right.
what kind of projects will eventually come up there.
Okay.
So it's also like the need for engaging with the state governments is what is needed. But I think the larger challenge here is because of this GDP-led growth. I mean, and like we can, like whenever we talk about infrastructure, we cannot remove governments from the picture.
No,
Because,
we can't.
because the private, like any kind of these, the land, the sanctions, the regulations, everything is being driven by them.
Yeah.
So, and somewhere like the question which you are like posing is that why, even if it's like many times not financially viable, but why the governments are pushing, I think somewhere partly it's the political agenda, because you need to keep showing to the voters that you are
You're doing
something,
something.
you are doing
Yeah.
something, and the other it keeps the economy, engine of the economy running. Because even if like some business, some venture goes in a loss, but still means that the laborers are employed, raw materials are extracted, some kind of economic activity happens, so that the engine keeps running. For that, it's very important to push that like something happening, whether it's at the end relevant to the people or not. But you will like people take pride that we have like so many 4-lane highways. How many are actually using it is a different question. So it helps to remove people from the picture, because you can keep saying that India has so many these mega infrastructure projects. So I think it's more of the political discourse which is driving.
And even if you have regulatory boards, the sort of system is game, where so you have to submit a feasibility report. It will be done by KPMG, which is also sort of part of this.
So how does one
nexus.
expose this? I mean, like in terms of how does one expose that this is what is going on, and to a lay audience, whether it's through media work or other kind of. I think that is something that is a critical.
It's not, because I was in Nagpur last month, meeting with Jammu and others. If you go to the city of, it's Gadkari's constituency, so he's just constructing things left, right and center. Elevated roads where it's not needed, there's a metro coming up in Nagpur, and it's like a massive metro, there's lake restoration going on.